Hello, my name is Bob Heilbrunner, and this is a video of the talk I gave to the third class of a class I'm offering at OLLI, which is an extension of the local university, extension service of the local university. The class is called Living a Meaningful, Joyful, Grateful, Engaged Life in Hard Times. And in the past, the class it's called Support for Living a Meaningful Life in Dark Times. And in the past, it's been called Belonging to Ourselves, Each Other, and the Planet. So, which is a core concept in the course, to belong. Can we find our belonging? And it's a course that's a direct, this support for living a meaningful life in dark times is a direct response to the MAGA experience and the experience of living fascism that we are living in today. And the class, the overall structure of the class is that we need to shift from what I'm calling a paradigm of narcissism to a paradigm of communion and belonging and membership. A communion that recognizes that we're all in this together and that we are all dependent on being on our membership in the web of life, which is created by the ancient associations and co-creations and agreements and cooperative relationships that have been developed by nature over the years to create the web of life upon which all life depends. So that's the overall picture. And in that model, each paradigm is, the narcissistic paradigm is graphed as a series of concentric circles to reflect the fact that the narcissistic paradigm and its principles affect us at every level of our lives, from the most personal to the political, to the social, to the ecological, to the spiritual. And therefore the class is organized around how we can resist and transform that paradigm, which is based on the idea that life is the basic principle of the narcissistic paradigm is that life is a competitive conflict between essentially incompatible forces, and therefore a zero-sum contest, where what I get is at the expense of the other, whatever the other is, whether it's another person, another race, another species, and so forth. And the paradigm that we need to transition to is one that's in the Native American expression would be called a paradigm of all our relations, a paradigm that recognizes the interdependence of all life and finding our appropriate and correct membership in the larger web of the whole that is the condition for the existence of everything. So that's the big picture. And so today's class is focusing on the psychological realm and talking about narcissism on the psychological realm. There's other classes, such as one that's, for instance, one of the where narcissism is reflected on the political realm is in fascism, and we'll be looking at that and how it also is represented on the economic realm. But today, it's about how the narcissistic paradigm functions on the psychological level. So today, we're looking at narcissism on the psychological level. And that means, how does narcissism get created? How do narcissists get created? Look at child psychological development. and how narcissism manifests and how it relates to the world and its effect on the others. Now, the individual psychology of narcissism is embedded in the paradigm of narcissistic values, institutions, how we raise our children. And the narcissistic society promotes, rewards, and breeds narcissism. And we'll look at that on different levels, but on the level of normal human development and on the level of sociopathic narcissism. But right now we're talking about narcissism in the extreme pathological, narcissistic, antisocial, malignant level, as represented by our president. So we'll look at that first. So actually, the biggest confusion about narcissism is the idea that a narcissist is someone who loves themselves too much, who loves themselves too much. Actually, a narcissist does not love themselves or accept themselves or even experience themselves. What they love is their image of themselves. So the original story of Narcissus is that Narcissus looks into the water and sees his reflection and falls in love with his reflection, with his image, not with himself, not his inner experience, but with his image of himself. The extreme narcissist is someone who's the sociopathic narcissist is someone whose authentic experience of themselves, their access to an authentic emotional self, has been so thoroughly attacked and annihilated in their development that they have no experience of an authentic self as a ground for their experience. They have no access to an authentic self as a ground for their experience. In the extremist case of a narcissist, there is no authentic self inside. So unlike the emperor has no clothes, this is more like the clothes have no emperor. The costume is empty inside. And that is, if you think about that, that is a fundamentally terrifying, existentially terrifying feeling, to have no self, to have just a vast emptiness inside, a black hole inside. That experience would be devastating and paralyzing if the psychological structure of an extreme narcissist would allow them to feel it. The grandiose facade, narcissistic facade, is a defense and a delusion against having to feel that emptiness inside. And it is held with the desperate fierceness of a defense that staves off existential terror. We see this in the relentless compulsion to demonstrate dominance and grandeur in every relationship at every moment. Everything that happens, every interaction is perceived and responded to based on whether it affirms or attacks and undermines the narcissistic facade. Narcissistic life is organized around the care and feeding and the constant upkeep required by the narcissistic facade. In the extreme case, that facade is defended and maintained as though life depended on it, because psychological life does depend on it. So that's the extreme case, which we'll get back to, which relates to the MAGA experience. But now I want to talk about normal narcissism, which is an issue for all human beings and everyone in this class and myself. On the normal spectrum, we all struggle to unconditionally accept and love ourselves. And we all have wounds and holes in our self-acceptance. And we all have ego defenses that we hang our hat on to feel good about ourselves. A healthy human maturing process is one in which we become decreasingly conditional, less and less conditional. Is the normal maturing process is one where we become less and less conditional in our self-acceptance, which is to say more and more unconditional in our self-acceptance. That is to say, to accept ourselves as we really are, including our weaknesses and warts and failings. Now, based on our childhood, we all have been offered different foundations for our self-acceptance. And the basic idea of whether I and the world can get along is shaped very early in the first year, actually, first 3 years, but especially in the first months and years. Whether I and the world can get along is shaped early. And therefore, whether I'm okay and the world is okay, whether I experience myself as okay and the world is okay is one thing. Now, of course, an infant cannot say, gee, I'm fine, but the world sucks, right? The world is no good, but that's not about me. That's not my fault. Obviously, their identity isn't separated enough from the reflected identity of the infant. The identity of the infant is not separated enough from the other and the world and its experience. So either the world is okay and I'm okay, or the world is okay and I'm not okay. And that feeling that I'm okay and that the world and I can get along is developed as the child's needs are responded to. So if the child cries and someone comes and goes goo, 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 or someone comes and relates to it, or someone changes the diaper, or someone offers it feeding, a breast with milk or a bottle, then the child learns that its needs are responded to by the world and that it and the world that can get along. Even the imperfection of the way the world responds is important. So for instance, the child cries and someone comes and tries to change the diaper, but really that's not the issue. The child is hungry, or so the fact that the person attending to the need fumbles around and doesn't necessarily mind read and exactly get the need right is also important, because what the child develops then is the ability to tolerate some frustration, but also to believe that the world is in the process of, if imperfectly, responding to its needs, that the world responds. Now, as we get older, there's degrees to which we all have been, to some degree, imperfectly accepted by our family. And that's largely shaped by those aspects of themselves that our parents and the family was not okay with, and therefore is not okay to see reflected in their children, so that those limitations of those conditions of acceptability and of being okay are passed on from generation to generation in some form. I'm reminded of the movie Annie Hall, right, with where when they go to Annie Hall's family, Woody Allen can't believe that they're all so nice. They're all so nice and so sweet, whatever. And when she goes to his house, she can't believe that they're always arguing and yelling at each other. So there's a whole family system. In Annie Hall's family system, it's okay to be, it's promoted to be nice, and it's not okay to be angry. It's not okay to stand up for yourself. In Woody Allen's Jewish family, it's okay to argue and be aggressive and stand up for yourself and fight, And it's not okay to be weak and to show weakness, because you'll be victimized and not respected. So so if you come from a compliant family, it's likely that you're aggressive and standing up for yourself. Aspects have been not well accepted in the family, and that you have probably nurtured your kindness and your sweetness and your compliance, and it's likely that you will have put aside and not included and accepted your angry side or your standing up for yourself side. On the other hand, if you're in this family where it's important to be aggressive, you will have likely to have developed the part of you that stands up and doesn't get pushed around, and likely to have less acceptance of the part of you that's meek, the part of you that gets scared, the part of you that's afraid of conflict. So one view, now we're talking about this is a healthy, normal process, right? One view of therapy is that how therapy heals is when you get witnessed in your excluded and neglected and shunned parts of yourself that you have not accepted, when you get witnessed in that by a therapist who is not offended or shocked or grossed out by the parts of you that you don't like, that you don't accept well, but sees those parts with acceptance. And that then invites the client to start to integrate and include their projected parts, and therefore to become wholer. To become their wholer self. At that point, we broke my talk up and had a conversation about a discussion based on this. And the questions for the discussion were, what was not allowed in your family? What behaviors were not accepted or allowed in your family? And how does that affect you still? How do you still not allow the things that were not encouraged in your family? And then how have you learned to accept and integrate a larger self, the unwatered parts of yourself? And how can this group experience of this class, the community that we're creating in this class, help you in your self-acceptance process? Now, this is an ongoing, and that was an interesting discussion with people sharing both how they developed their strengths from what was encouraged, but also the downside of their strengths, and how they started to include for themselves the aspects of themselves that they projected. Now, this is an ongoing and imperfect process. I remember when I was a young therapist in Sonoma County, we went to a talk in a large auditorium by a famous therapist who was 80 years old and was sort of the dean of Sonoma County therapists. And at one point he's talking, and at one point he stops and he says, "Wait a minute, my mother issues just came up." And I remember us young guys went, "His mother issues? This is an 80-year-old famous therapist and his mother issues still come up." So that was interesting. So it's an ongoing process. And what it requires is for us to love and have mercy for our imperfections and to cultivate mercy. Now, this part has been a discussion of normal child development. Now I'm going to go back to Trump and to the extreme antisocial narcissists, the antisocial level of narcissism. There's extreme pathological malignant narcissism. Now, I didn't, as a therapist, didn't need to have anything, to know anything about Trump's childhood to know how he got that way. Since then, there's books by his sister and others that sort of confirm this, but if you're a therapist with any understanding, you don't need to know how he got this way, because there's only one way to get that way. And what you can tell is that he was ruthlessly, from childhood on, ruthlessly attacked anytime he showed any genuine feeling or any genuine vulnerability. That vulnerability, emotions, feelings were not allowed and ruthlessly attacked. And only dominance was allowed. And that went on at such a level. I mean, that's not just a preference, that's just at a virulent level. And that went on until eventually Trump killed off his own ability. He killed off his own ability to experience genuine emotions and thus to feel them in his body and thus to have an emotional insides, to have an insides, because it was too dangerous to do so. So that's back to the robes have no emperor. Back to an emptiness that has to be compulsively defended against by holding up a billboard poster that the world must bow down to. Now, most of us are tired of the amount of energy we have to give to Trump because we're exhausted by the way he takes up all the air in the room. But we have a revenge available to us. This is our revenge. He cannot learn from his experience, but we can. We can learn from our Trump experience. And that's because Trump did not become president because history was asleep at the wheel and made a great big boo-boo. Trump became president because he can show us in garish cartoon color what our culture has got wrong. And I talked about this in a previous class, but to review, when he said he could shoot someone in Fifth Avenue and there'd be no consequences, he told us the core principles of his worldview. One is that it's all about him. The person who gets shot doesn't matter. That there is no internal moral compass to prevent him from doing this. The only thing that would prevent him is if it would cost him winning, but it doesn't cost him winning because principle 3, that he is immune from the consequences of his actions. He's just too big to be immune, too big to be held accountable, and therefore is immune from the consequences of his actions. Now, of course, he's been confirmed in that in a historically mind-blowing way that is hard to imagine, but nevertheless, that's his core belief. And but if you can't learn from the consequences of your actions, if you're immune from the consequences of your actions, you cannot learn from your actions. You cannot learn from your experience if you are immune from the consequences of your actions. And I also said last time that pretty well describes the behavior of our species in its present civilized form in the world. So right now we're experiencing sort of a perfect storm in which the narcissistic culture is part of what helped create Trump, and Trump imposes his psychology on the culture, on a culture which is vulnerable to and receptive to narcissism, and thereby is able to impose his narcissism on a culture that's vulnerable to it for the same reasons that he got created. Now, it's important to note Trump is not lying when he says that he won the election. So when we say he lies, it's not quite it. He is psychologically incapable of losing an election. When he says he won the election, he's not lying. He says that because he is psychologically incapable of losing an election, of losing anything else. And the fragile structure of his narcissistic delusion simply cannot tolerate or conceive of or countenance the possibility of losing. To lose is to be psychologically annihilated. And that's why whenever, but he's always on the edge, right? He's always pushing stuff, so he's always risking disaster. But his only response to that emergency is to escalate is to escalate his behavior and escalate his attempt at dominance, which is a vulnerability of authoritarians, including like Hitler, couldn't stop. Right? They can't stop. They need to constantly demonstrate dominance because if the moment they don't, they're in a fragile position, psychologically fragile position. So, for instance, Hitler couldn't stop with just dominating Europe. He had to invade Russia as well. And that's why his 1,000-year Reich lasted 8 years before he was huddled in a basement under the ruins of his nation, the nation that he was leading. Now, my wife Lisa says what she says about Trump is he never got to talk. He never got to talk. And then she does the talk, which is something else. Because, and then you can imagine a 9-year-old kid playing Little League, 11-year-old, or 4-year-old. So she says, now, Trumpy, we all like to win. I mean, when we win, we feel good about ourselves and we feel proud. That's a really good feeling. But sometimes we lose. And that's not as much fun. But you know what? When we win, it doesn't mean that we're better than everybody else and everybody else is just a piece of crap. And when we lose, it doesn't mean that we're a worthless piece of junk. Because you are a worthwhile human being because you're you, whether you win or you lose. And I will love you and care for you and respect you, whether you win or lose. And I want you to feel good about yourself, whether you win or lose. And what's more, when you lose, it's kind of nice to let the other people enjoy winning. It's kind of nice to admit that you lost and to celebrate, to let the other you to have joy and, well, at least to tolerate that, to not ruin the fun of those who won, their pleasure in having won, just as you want to have your pleasure when you. All right, that takes us to next question, which brings us to the obvious mind-boggling question: how does he get away with this? Why do people follow and join in his delusion? And this puts us as a nation in the position of every person, often women, of every person who has had to live their lives in the orbit of a pathological narcissist. But what the charismatic narcissist offers his followers is the infectious high of basking in his glory and thus imagining themselves participants in that glory, being great again. And this is particularly attractive to those who have not come to feel included in the existing status quo, who feel that their place in the existing status quo is threatened. Now, to understand how this works, it's good to understand that the world is a beautiful place and it's a dangerous place. It's a scary place that will ultimately kill us. I mean, we will all ultimately die. And it's a world of beauty and wonder that sustains and nurtures us. And so we have developed parts of our psyche, parts of our brain structure to deal with both aspects of the world. And I'm going to start by talking about the alarm system. The oldest system, which is sort of the reptilian part of the brain, it's at the base of the brain, is the alarm system or the emergency system. It's in the brainstem, and it responds. And its job is to respond to crisis. It's about survival, immediate survival, and a response to crisis. And its job is actually to commandeer the whole body, the whole system, the whole brain, the whole organism, to commandeer it in a crisis. So, for instance, if there's an emergency crisis, there isn't time for the emotional part to kick in or for the executive function of the brain to kick in. So let's say you hear a sound, a shot. You don't have time to go like, whoa, that was a shot. That could be aimed at me. Well, if that was aimed at me, that could be a bullet flying at me right now. And God, if that hit me, that could really hurt. I could even die. I think I'm going to duck. Okay. You don't have time for that. To either think or feel that. What you do is you duck, because the immediate crisis system commandeers the brain to deal immediately with a crisis and with a vocabulary that involves fight, flight, or going dormant, depending on the situation. The first thing is to run, if you can, to duck, to run. The second thing is to fight and defend yourself, if you can. And the third thing, if that's not working and you're overpowered, to go dormant and play dead. So that's the emergency brainstem, reptilian part of the brain. And it has a very important and appropriate role to play in crisis. Now, PTSD is when the brain is caught in when that crisis mode is on inappropriately, when it's ongoingly on, when you're living in crisis mode, or when you're suddenly triggered, when you're subject to being triggered to be suddenly in crisis mode, and then to behave in some way that's unmodulated by the other parts of your brain. For instance, early on, I talked with I had a client who was a soldier, who was a recluse. He was afraid to go out into the street. And when we explored why, it was because when he was in Vietnam, a child was used to bring a bomb that attacked his troop. And he's afraid that if a child comes at him quickly, he will respond as though he were back then and do something terrible to an innocent child. So he's terrified of his PTSD response, and until he gains some ability to control it and modulate it and handle it, he's afraid he'll do something terrible. So So PTSD is when you're constantly or unpredictably triggered to be in crisis mode and therefore to react fiercely, violently, and dangerously. An example of that, of living in the crisis mode, is Steve Miller was interviewed, and he expressed what's really the sort of the Nazi worldview. He said, I wrote this down, "We live in the real world that is, I'm sorry, I need my glasses for this. I wrote it too small." He says, "We live," the Trump people, "we live in the real world that is governed by strength, that is governed by force, that is governed by power. These are the iron laws of the world." We live in the real world that is governed by strength, that is governed by force, that is governed by power. These are the iron laws of the real world. So that's why Trump experiences life as a crisis of survival, why he always pushes it to be a crisis of survival. He's always either dominating the world or going to go to jail. Why he acts, I'm going to put my glasses on again. While he acts, why he experiences life as a crisis of survival. Why he acts as though the life was a crisis of survival. Why he's always on the razor's edge and pushing the limits to where it's win or die. Why he promotes chaos and hatred to recruit the nation to live in his world of crisis. Why he promotes chaos and hatred as a way to recruit the nation to live in his world of crisis. And why he responds to every conflict by escalating it into a crisis, and every crisis by escalating it further. So to activate, but he's setting us up, the populace up, to activate our primitive alarm and defense system. But we, humans, also inherited an affiliative part of the brain. I'm going to put my glasses on. Our mammalian nature to nurture our young, but we've also inherited an affiliative part of the brain, our mammalian nature to nurture our young, for bonds of affection with mates and friends and community. And that mammalian part of our brain is a powerful part of our evolutionary heritage and of our evolutionary survival kit. We've gathered from and that's what I'll call the affiliative part of our brain, the affiliative part of the brain that makes connections. It makes connections and that bonds with others in the world. And we have gathered from our long evolutionary dialogue with nature pro-social instincts that are vital, that are a vital foundation. They are a vital foundation for our evolutionary success and our instincts for competitive survival. We had, and we'll talk about this more, the development of pro-social instincts, which balance the instinct for separate survival. But I've summarized this, and we'll talk about this more in a coming class, but we have an adaptive, instinctual need and desire to be a significant, recognized, respected, witnessed, and empowered member of a meaningful whole that is greater than us, that gives meaning to our lives, and is ultimately sacred. I'm going to repeat that. We have an adaptive, instinctual need and desire, craving, to be a significant, recognized, respected, witnessed, and empowered member of a meaningful whole that is greater than us, that gives meaning to our lives, that is worthy of our allegiance, and ultimately sacred. When we have that, we are healthy and feel that we belong in this world, to each other and to the world. And when we are denied this, we are lonely, angry, and ultimately dangerous. So a society that does not offer its citizens a society that does not offer its citizens a secure place in a meaningful whole is vulnerable to being offered false belonging. It's false because in the MAGA universe, you're not genuinely empowered because you're only there insofar as you agree with the sacred leader, with the great leader. You're not really being witnessed as your actual self. You're only being witnessed as a follower. You don't have a secure membership because the one thing that's particularly obvious is the minute you cross Trump, he's out. He just cuts people off at the slightest slight. So you don't not securely a member. It's not worthy of your allegiance, and it is not sacred. It tries to employ symbols of sacredness like a flag or a red hat or whatever else, but it's nothing truly sacred about it. And this is especially true since the narcissistic paradigm does not easily or often offer an experience of empowerment that is respectful of the other or the needs of the whole, that supports the idea of being a servant leader, of using your powers to contribute and be part of and respectful of the whole. So it doesn't offer a model of a leadership who is a servant of the needs of his followers, his or her followers. So that MAGA movement offers its followers a choice within the movement, within that movement, offers a choice based on the activated alarm system and our collective cultural PTSD of joining in the admiration of the great leader and thus imagining ourselves as being dominant, or allying ourselves with the powerless and despised, with the other, and thus suffering the consequences. The healing of the MAGA experience, the underlying system of power and the healing of the MAGA experience and the underlying system of power and privilege that supports, promotes, and uses it is to build a society from the bottom up based on the understanding that we, as individuals, as sexes, as races, as nations, as species, and all our relations, that we are all in this together. The society which does its best to serve the material, psychological, and environmental and spiritual needs of its members. So, how do we participate in a healing of these personal and historic wounds? On the personal level, to practice as deep and unconditional acceptance as we can of who we authentically are, neither worthless wretches nor bigger than life superheroes of the narcissistic duality, but to offer our loving attention and nurturance to our wounded, imperfect, and beautiful selves. And on the planetary level, to recognize that we do belong to life, nature, and spirit, and allow ourselves to be resourced by and expressions of the spirit of the living whole. I'll say that again. On the planetary level, to recognize that we do belong to life, to nature, and to spirit, and to allow ourselves to be resourced by and expressions of the spirit of the living whole. To love, accept, and fight for our wounded, imperfect, and beautiful selves. To love and fight for our wounded, beautiful, and miraculous. Right? And that was the foundation, that was sort of the end of the talk, and that was the foundation for a discussion about how do we understand and relate to the others, relate to those people who on one level or other seem to us to be outside of the matter split. And I want to end by recommending a book. One of the books on the reading list is by Alexander Lowen, and it's called Denial of the True Self. And the basic idea is that the feelings are in the body. They are part of our evolutionary heritage as biological beings, mammals and humans. They're expressions of the life force as it experiences, as it expresses itself in us, and that cutting us off from our feelings of how that cutting us off from our own feelings, our own bodily sensations, our own evolutionary heritage, our own moral compass, our own internal guidance, is how systems of power rule over us, to rule over our inner and outer lives, to separate us from our emotional selves and our inner compass that's been gifted to us by nature. And setting themselves up, systems of power setting themselves up as middlemen, as gatekeepers between us and our natural selves. And this class tries to offer practices to get us in touch with our with nature inside us, with our internal guidance, with spirit as it's reflected in us, and to be nurtured by it and be expressions of it, to rest in it, and to be supported by it, and to be warriors to fight for it and defend it. And I think that's where I'm going to end this video.